Welcome to the Mind and Crip Theology podcast, hosted by Miriam Peace and Amy Patton, which come out of the Canadian Journal of Theology, Mental Health, and Disability.
We both live and work on lands that have been homes and remain homes to the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Neutral, and the Ojibwe Chippewa peoples and other peoples who have cared for the land.
We are grateful for the opportunity to live and work on this land and are mindful of the need to repair broken covenants.
This podcast is an opportunity to model how faith communities can engage in theological and spiritual conversations around madness and cripness.
If you need a full transcript, you can find our videos on our YouTube channel.
We want to say before we begin that topics and conversations we are raising throughout our time together are often hard.
They are hard for mad and crip people ourselves, and hard for our families and loved ones.
So do what you need to do to take care of yourselves, your bodies, minds, and hearts.
And now, here is our episode. Welcome, friends, to this episode of the Mind and Crip Theology podcast. Amy and I are delighted to be here with two of the authors from our fall issue, Erin Raffety and Heather Morgan. So we look forward to the conversation today, and let us know any thoughts you may have as you listen to this episode. Amy?
So welcome both Heather and Erin. We're so glad that you're here with us today. And we're just wondering if you could give a quick little introduction of yourselves, how we know you and what your work is right now. Also, would you be able to give us a quick visual description of yourself, just like what you're wearing and what you look like for our listeners? That'd be great. Erin, I'm going to invite you to go first. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. Okay, I want to make sure I get all of the introductory pieces. So I'm Erin Raffety. This is my daughter, Lucia, who's with me today. She is kind of one of my major connections to the work that I do. Lucia is 7 years old and she has multiple disabilities, and she's a really good teacher for me. So I figured I might as well have her along today. Also, we don't have childcare and it's a snow day. I'm here in New Jersey. And so it's like lovely, but all sorts of things are discombobulated. Let's see, I know Miriam because when I was teaching at Princeton Theological Seminary in 2018, we hosted a conference on disability and youth ministry. And Miriam was one of the paper prize winners for this Emerging Scholars invitation that we did, call for papers. And honestly, that conference is so special to me still, because all of the folks who presented papers became, again, like teachers to me and colleagues. And so it's been a joy to continue to read your work, Miriam, and to follow your career. Amy, I am getting to talk with you for the first time, so I'm really happy about that today. I was saying to Heather before we started, Heather and I have never connected before, but we've connected on Twitter. So that's been fun. And then Heather and I are dressed oddly similarly today. So I am wearing a gray turtleneck, and I have shoulder length brown hair. Lucia is wearing a magenta. Would you say that's magenta or pink, Lucia? She says she doesn't know. That means I don't know when she looks up because she nods yes and no. Lucia is wearing, I think it's a magenta shirt, and she has her front teeth growing in. And we're seated in my living room today in New Jersey. Did I hit everything? My pronouns are she, her, hers.
Yes, Erin, thank you so much. That was great. Welcome to you and Lucia. And Heather, would you mind introducing yourself?
Thanks. I'm Heather Morgan. I use she, her pronouns. I am an associate pastor at Vox Alliance Church in Barrie, Ontario, and I'm working on my MDiv at Emmanuel College at the University of Toronto. I live with hereditary undiagnosed neuromuscular conditions that mean I use a power wheelchair. And I share this condition with my mom and my 2 young adult children, one of whom also has a power wheelchair. And my family and I are also all on the autism spectrum somewhere, depending on who we are and what day it is. My connection to this journal and indeed to Emmanuel College and doing this work came also through Miriam, who I met at a disability conference the year after Erin did in 2019 at Emmanuel. And meeting Miriam was the first chance I had to meet somebody else with lived experience with disabilities who was doing this work. And it started that initial meeting, and then the conversations that she and I continued to have over the coming months were part of what helped me to see that there was a place for me and my story in this work. And that's been really, really critical for me. So when I had a paper that I was excited about as a first-year MDiv student, it just made sense to me to talk to Amy and Miriam about having it in this journal. As Erin said, yeah, I'm dressed fairly similarly. I'm wearing a black and white sock monkey style sweater. You can see on the sleeves, it's got the red bands and the white, which is nice because it is -16 where I live right now. And that's Celsius. I don't know what it is in Fahrenheit, I'm sorry. And I have white freckly skin and short brown hair with a good number of white hairs starting to show through in that. I'm wearing rose gold colored metal framed glasses, and I'm sitting in a tilt and recline power wheelchair in a nice light office with white bookshelves along my left-hand side.
Thank you so much, Heather. And I was envious of how organized all of your books are on your bookshelf. I will not turn my camera to show people my bookshelf because it's like an explosion, pretty much.
This was my husband's present to me for Christmas, was new bookshelves. So they are freshly installed and freshly organized. I'm very excited about it.
That is such a thoughtful gift.
Awesome. I have piles of books surrounding me here, and don't ask me to find anything on my desk. But thank you, Heather and Erin, for those great introductions, and I feel privileged to have met and know you both. And I know Amy does as well. I remembered we didn't do our visual questions, Amy, so I'm also in a power wheelchair. I have headphones on and pinkish glasses with short blonde hair and a sweater with icy mountain on. And Amy.
Yeah, well, I'm rocking my COVID cut still. Since COVID started, I have not seen a hairdresser. So this is like my impromptu, like, oh, I need a haircut. So I have curly blonde hair. I'm wearing black glasses and a striped white and purple t-shirt, and I'm sitting amongst quite a messy room today. So I've made it so my camera only shows the clean part of the room, which is possible on Zoom. So thanks, Miriam.
So we'll jump into our first question, which is for both of you. And you both talk about the importance of making space and spaces for disabled voices. And how can churches center modern Crip voices? Have you seen this being done before, or could this is short, simple question to start us off? Heather, I'd invite you to begin.
Sure. I think making space for disabled voices in the church is hugely important. And I would add, and it's not just that it's important for those with disabilities or those who have mad and crip voices, it's for everyone. The whole church benefits from it when our voices are present. In the world that I grew up in and ministered in before my mid-30s, I had very few examples of mad or crip voices in the church. And honestly, a lot of the ones that I did see were kind of cringeworthy experiences of either tokenism or segregation. I also grew up in a church where women weren't allowed to speak. So the combination of these two factors always made it difficult for me to picture myself as having a place in the church to use my gifts or to build up the body. For me, that changed about 10 years ago. I moved churches, and our senior pastor at the church I'm at now, he came to the church about 14 years ago, just following a severe mental health breakdown that had also included becoming addicted to his ADHD medication. And in what I think was a very vulnerable move, he chose not to keep those things from our community. And he could have just disclosed them to the elders in his hiring practices or hiring process or whatever, but instead he chose to frequently and regularly include references to his mental health issues in his sermons. And that vulnerability in turn made space for others to see a place for themselves at the table in our church. It shaped him as a leader and helped him to see the importance of discipling those who are mad and crip the same way he would disciple anyone else in the church. And it meant that I had a lot of encouragement from him when I felt the call to ordination myself. I think it was part of what made him willing to do things like the work that was necessary to find ways to get me and my 350-pound power wheelchair up onto our otherwise inaccessible stage in our rented space. And I consider myself really, really fortunate because I now serve as one of 3 people on this pastoral team, and all of us are either mad, neurodivergent, or crip, or some combination of the 3. And I think our congregation really benefits from this as well.
Can I ask a follow-up? Just how has that leadership been received by the congregation, by congregants?
So Vox is kind of a weird church, I guess, in that what has happened is that there's an awful lot of folks in our community now who are who would say, I have a mental health issue, or I'm neurodivergent. So I think it has attracted others with disabilities to the church, but the church isn't by the same token, like an exclusively disabled or disability or mental health church. And what I see is that those who come and stay at Vox are really drawn to the fact that it's a place where we are vulnerable. And I think that our discipleship goes deeper because of it. I think that we're able to build much deeper relationships with one another because of it. And it's not like it's something that's used, sort of to create some false formula or I'm not sure the word for it right now, but there's no cage around it. It's the natural outcoming of it is that we don't have the choice to not be vulnerable with each other. And we don't have the choice for our faith to not actually touch us where life really matters. We can't fake it till we make it, because none of us are going to make it if we do that. And so instead we just have to show up and be real. And I think that God does something really amazing in that space, in fully incarnating our bodies for the gospel.
Well, thank you, Heather, so much for sharing. And Erin, same question to you.
Thanks, Heather, for your response. I saw a lot of symmetry between what you wrote about in your article and your personal experience in the argument that you make about this is not just about like inclusion for disabled people's sake. This is about the way in which disabled leadership transforms the church and is faithful to Jesus's call to ministry. And I think the Spirit's transformative leadership. So I just really appreciated hearing that again. I come at this slightly differently because I'm not a person who has a visible disability, but your experience made me think about how the church that I pastored, which I always felt kind of in awe of, that it was a church where I think about 30% of the folks that worshiped there were folks that identified as having disabilities. And I thought that was like really novel and amazing. But then I really thought about it this way. I think back on it, and I was one of the pastors. And, of course, my daughter has a visible disability. And she was very involved in the church. She was born right before I started the job, and we were part of the church. So people knew her and got to know her and got to know the entire experience of us navigating her disability. And then the pastor that I worked with, her husband, who has since passed away, sadly, had multiple sclerosis and was in a power wheelchair. So it didn't really occur to me. I mean, I feel like this is where the ableism is really strong, that like navigating these relational experiences in front of the church could be a gift to the church, which I think it absolutely was. I feel like I often experience the flip side, the frustration of just kind of like the microaggressions and the comments and feeling like your whole life as a pastor is on display and you want a little bit of privacy and all of those pieces. And so I think there's a real cost, right? And a challenge to this vulnerability, as beautiful as it is, right? But the other things that I kind of have been working on or getting at in my work, like maybe you see in this commentary piece, is the fact that in order for there to be space for disabled folks to work out their calls to ministry and to lead, there also needs to be like a decentering, right, of the ableism and able-bodied folks in all these positions of kind of power and leadership, and that's faithful too. And I think that's part of the movement of justice. That's not kind of like the only answer here. And like Heather, you mentioned tokenism, that plugging people into leadership positions. I don't think that's really the model we get from Jesus. But I also think that there's a tendency for churches that do not have a lot of folks that are comfortable being open about their experiences of disability to say, oh, we don't have any people with disabilities. And, of course, that's not true. And that's a function of ableism. And so some of my excitement in the research that I did, that I mentioned in the commentary, but that's kind of forming this book that I'm working on, was around watching churches that kind of fell into supporting user-led groups or free spaces for disabled ministries. And I think there's this binary that we kind of have sometimes in church ministry, that it's like, well, if it's a ministry that's run by disabled people for disabled people, it's separate, and then therefore it's not good, right? But in the cases that we saw, the able-bodied church, or the church that didn't have a lot of expression of disability, if they played host to a ministry that was run by disabled people for disabled people, so user-led, a free space, it was kind of tremendous to watch what the Spirit could do through that free space, kind of disrupting all of the ableist paradigms that are present in that church. But the tendency, of course, I think, is for able-bodied church leaders to like try to control it or micromanage it or get in, and like that's not gracious hosting. And so these are some of the invitations that I try to offer to churches, but I also feel like there's this really important work, which is kind of what I was getting at in my commentary, about repenting of ableism, being honest about ableism, listening to the rebukes of disabled people, even if they're hard to hear. And like all of that kind of groundwork is really essential, because otherwise I think there still will be this power struggle, power dynamic, where there really isn't a space to nurture disabled folks so that they can flourish and lead, because able-bodied folks still have like a hand on things. This is a really long answer, but there's two more things that come to mind. So one is just to say that the other thing that I've noticed from my research that I'm working with a little bit lately and trying this out, so we'll see if it works for you, is that churches are primarily able-bodied. Like if you think about the empirical reality of churches, I don't think they can be like, sounds like Heather's churches could be, but I think they really struggle to be mirrors for disabled folks navigating their calls to ministry. And so I work with like this distinction between mirrors and accomplices in the kingdom of God. And the accomplices is not my word. That's from autistic activist Rayma McCoy McDeed. And I love what she says. It's like, rather than allyship, she says accomplices, because the idea is like, there's something at stake for you too, able-bodied person, in seeking justice in the world. Like you're going to have to give up, like, and betray, right, your able-bodied privilege, all of this stuff. But I love kind of that idea that there are roles for all of us. And I think it's, and I don't mean to be so strict about it's this for you or this for that, but just to notice, right, that I think sometimes there's been a little bit of role confusion there in the church, and that hasn't served us well when we don't live in a world in which non-disabled, disabled are like parallels. There is a relationship of oppression. So sorry for going on and on and on, but it was a great question. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to you both. You've given me so much to think about. We wanted to ask you questions about our God images, because Miriam and I seem to come back to this a lot, or maybe it's like my own obsession, and I keep coming back to it a lot on our podcasts and in our work in the journal. But Erin, we had this question for you. We wanted you to think a little bit about how does it change our God image when we realize that Jesus has something to learn from people with disabilities and from people who have a lived experience of mental distress. And, we also wanted to ask you what you think about how does it change our relationship with others? So, I'll say it again. How does it change our God image when we realize that Jesus has something to learn from disabled folks? Now we've got the long questions, so.
Yeah, no, and I think, so I'm an anthropologist, like converted to being a practical theologian. So I feel like I'm always like dancing on the edge of heresy, and I like need people to sort of pull me back. But I wonder if that's okay, in that one of the things that I love about being in dynamic relationship with God, with the Christian God, with Jesus, with the Spirit, is like, I think, our God is a relational God, and we can bring our full selves, right, and all of our questions. And for me, a big part of it is like our rage. And so what I kind of hope, and I was so like in awe of the reading that Moira Egan, and I talk about this in my commentary piece, like does of this Bartimaeus text. I think that's what you're referring to, Amy, where she says that Jesus like actually hears something critical in the address that, it is a lament, it is a plea for mercy from Bartimaeus, but it's also like, hey, wake up, I'm here. And then there's this concern from her that like Jesus kind of keeps walking, like it's not an immediate turnabout. And so what I was trying to wrestle with is like, what do we do with that? What do we do with a God that we worry fails to listen? And I think that we have to be honest about those questions before God. There have been so many times in this pandemic where I feel like I am screaming into a void. Like I'm not, I'm worried about the safety of my child. And I am so concerned about the way, and you are in Canada, but I'm in the United States, like my country is treating disabled people in the midst of this really life-threatening crisis. And, I cannot be in relationship with a God who I can't hold back those cries, right? And I think of Jesus on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so I think that this is a dynamic dialogical relationship. And I think so often, and this is probably the cultural anthropologist in me, we kind of don't delve into how the cultural circumstances of Jesus's time impinge on him as a human being. And I think we see a little bit of that in this text. I think we see a little bit of it in the, text with the Canaanite woman. Like, I'm not saying that, Jesus is not God, and I'm not saying that Jesus's ministry is not important here, but I'm simply saying that Jesus is implicated by the cultural circumstances in which he lives. Like, it's a good thing that the text shows that, something like, now it's not the same, but something like ableism exists at the time, right? And Jesus is like trying to figure out how to navigate this. And he's also ushering in this new kingdom. He's trying to, usher in this new kingdom and get people to understand what he's about. And I think it's like only natural that we're asking those questions, like, what are you about? Because sometimes I'm like, these healing texts are really, really difficult for me. And I simply want us to be honest about that. So I guess the answer to the question is, I think it makes our God image more human. And I hope that that's good, because I don't think it takes away from from Jesus as God to say that Jesus is paying sustained attention to that person in front of him in a way that makes him very much in the world, but not of it. That's what I feel like I get, like when I really kind of follow disabled readings of this passage. And then in terms of each other, I, feel like there's so many times, and this is the listening even unto rebuke part, where like we talk about welcome and hospitality and inclusion. And then when someone says something critical, like we tell them, well, not that. And so it's not really hospitality and welcome, right? It's to a point, and it still kind of actually preserves the status quo. And so like the radical fellowship that I'm looking for is the kind, and I need Jesus to do this, where, someone can come at me with something and say, this is really problematic, or this isn't working for me, or I'm really hurt by this, right? They say that to the church. And instead of the church saying, well, actually, defending themselves, the church says, you know what? We're going to come alongside you in that pain, because that's not okay. And we're going to say we're sorry, because we know that we're probably participating in that pain. And we're going to shut up, so we can hear a little bit more about what's going on. And so I think I just think that sometimes, those deep emotional affronts, feel like the end of conversation when they're just the very beginning. And we're not going right deep with each other in Christian community and fellowship and intimacy. I totally envy what Heather was talking about in terms of we have to be ourselves. I'm like, yes, that's it.
Thank you so much, Erin. Miriam, do you want to ask the next one?
I love that. I love that word you use about sustained attention to people. Like how can we encourage people to have sustained attention with each other that goes beyond fake how are you today or how's the weather, to gain that intimacy and then to learn about what else we can do to be church. So thank you. And now we'll turn to Heather to talk about your amazing piece for a bit. And so a couple questions for you as well. Why was Gregory so important for you to dig into? And how did it feel for you unearthing this document and sharing it with the journal for the first time?
So I'm interested that Erin is a cultural anthropologist. I did my BA in history. And so I also have always had a fascination with the lives of particularly like the regular, average, everyday person who lived a long time ago. So coming into my first church history course with this interest in disability theology, I was particularly interested in asking how the early church was responding to those with disabilities. And, you know, there wasn't a lot, obviously, in my early church history class. But when it came time to do my final paper for this class, I knew I wanted to try to find something that would connect with disability if possible. And one of my mentors actually suggested Oration 14. I would never have found it by myself. I'm very grateful for that. And I think, you know, we have this tendency to think about people in history as being less advanced theologically or less advanced socially in terms of their ideas, or having, I don't know, like a simpler idea of how to do life. But for me, reading Oration 14 just blew all of those out of the water when it came to disability theology. I read it for the first time, and as I was doing that, like the words just jumped off the page at me because it felt so profound. As I was reading this early church father who's raising money to build one of the first Christian hospitals ever, and he talks about those with disabilities not as charity cases, but as ministers of the gospel who are critical for the spiritual health and eternal salvation of their community. Like that just, to me, that I sat with that for so long with so much excitement, because to find that in a text on disability theology at all is still very rare. To find it on a text from the end of the 4th century is just mind-blowing to me. The charity model that we've created in the West and used in the Western church for centuries, it created all of this separation and this otherness, these power dynamics of donor and recipients. And Gregory Nazianzus is here saying, like, in the context of his fundraising that he still thinks is important, it's the rich and able-bodied whose spiritual health is in desperate need of the ministry of the lepers around them. And yet this piece that, to me, like, it's so obvious in the text, I, as a first year MDiv student, assumed, well, like everybody's already talking about this. This isn't anything new. And I went and did my research, and I was able to actually find, well, everything, at least in the Toronto School of Theology's, in the U of T's library system, on this passage, because there's only like 15 papers or chapters on this passage that I could find anywhere. And so I was able to read all of them. And then I got really surprised because it seemed like there were no other conversations going on about this in the literature already. So for me, at that point, it became this very deep excitement to be able to, so early in my academic work, find something that was new and that hadn't been talked about, and that was so potentially transformative for the way that we think about disability theology in the church.
Excellent. Thank Heather. It was such a joy to receive your paper and be able to publish your first of many articles, I think. When you were talking about people with disabilities being miniature, that week we saw that, I was reminded of an interview I heard last week after Desmond Tutu's death with Michael Lapsey. I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. But Father Michael was a priest in South Africa who received a letter bomb during the time of apartheid, and both his hands were taken off by that explosion, and he went to his bishop at that time, and his bishop said, I have no use for you now that you're disabled. And I forget how, but he ended up going to Archbishop Tutu, and he was welcome there because Archbishop Tutu said, I have a blind pastor, I have this and that, and you are needed in the service of God. So your history reminded me of people doing that today. So that's great, Heather. Yeah, turn it over to Amy.
Thank you so much, Heather, for that. This is my favorite part of the podcast, where we get to ask you guys to talk to each other about each other's work. And when Miriam and I were pairing people up for our spring podcast, we were so excited to we were like, oh, we can't wait to hear them talk together on the podcast. So I wonder, Erin, would you like to start us off and share any thoughts you had about Heather's paper, or any questions you might have for her?
Sure. Heather, I'm grateful that you pointed to our kind of, I don't know what you call it, like mutual backing into practical theology, because when I read history, I feel a little bit out of my depth, it's all so new to me. I deal with the living people. So I was, I think you you capture so sincerely, like you said, like, I don't know if this is the right term, but kind of like the really progressive theology here, and the really, I love anything that's kind of like radical and disruptive. And I feel like it is, in the sense that, you know, the lines that stuck out to me when you talked about how the leper becomes a teacher and a leader in this way. And I think, Miriam, the, you know, story that you just alluded to, I think there are these moments, right, where history can enlarge our theological imagination. Like, you know, we kind of go back to something that's unfamiliar to us. Like, we're not, you know, steeped in a time where there's lots of people living with leprosy. That's not what we're thinking about. And so then this becomes like a kind of dramatic example of this, in my mind, is something like this critical edge, right, of charity. Because I think that I love that part. Like, I'm just going to be thinking about this for a long time. The way that he brings up, you know, you all are living, you all have a spiritual problem. And so there's that critical edge. So I guess that's the thing I wanted to hear you talk more about, is maybe what you, just let you talk about what you do with this, because I guess I always kind of have in my mind this, it's not oppositional, but maybe it's maybe contentious relationship between charity and justice. Like, I'm someone who is, you know, much more comfortable with, like, and that's what I'm writing on, is these kind of movements toward, you know, the disability justice movement, right? I think this is just such a important movement for our time. So even like seeing words like compassion in your paper, I'm like, I don't know. But then, you know, I was really convinced as I read, but I was just curious to hear you talk more about kind of maybe the relationship between something like charity and something like justice, or just this critical edge of charity, or whether you think this has something to offer to how we do, I don't know, like, should we be reclaiming charity today? These are the questions I came up with.
I think that's really interesting, because there's sort of the flip of the questions that I came up with for you. Because, you know, you talk about that subversive critical edge. And I was thinking about, you know, the ways in which the difference between caregivers and able-bodied ministers and able-bodied theologians who have been talking about disability theology and disability work, and those who have lived experience themselves, and where the critical edges are in that nuance. So I think that this is clearly a topic ripe for a conversation. I think the thing sorry, I sometimes stutter a little bit when I don't have it pre-prepared. For me, there is definitely that sense of discomfort and disquiet when it comes to charity, because I think what we have created with charity is this very binaristic, power-driven reality. And I think I'm getting to the point where I think that binaries might maybe be a result of the fall. This whole idea of being able to separate something into binaries of us and them in and of itself feels like it may have some inherent level of sinfulness to it. I think I've got a lot of work to do on that. But just even at this point, for me, it's a really challenging place when we set up these power dynamics. But at the same time, what Gregory's talking about when he's talking about charity seems to be subtly different than what I experience as charity in our world today. Because he's talking about like a mutual interdependence that says, my body has needs and your body has needs, and my mind and my spirit and my emotions have needs, and so do yours. And if we together join into this dance of God meeting the needs of all of us together, what would that look like? well, I'm still going to need help opening the door. I'm still going to need someone to build me a way to get up onto the stage. There's no way around that. But it stops being charity in this Western sense and moves to this like mutual interdependence that Gregory calls charity. I think as it does that, it changes the edge of it, and it moves it from a place of power dynamics that are really negative to a place of opportunity and possibility, I think.
Yeah, I really like that. And I definitely want, I feel like you didn't really get to ask me questions, but I wonder if it just sounds like we're closer in terms of what we're working on. And that some of, like you said, some of these terms and these binaries are getting in the way. And I think that, Jesus is a binary slayer because there's like this sense, I don't know, people talk about how like every time you think, Jesus draws a line, and you're seeing someone on the other side of the line, like he steps to the other side of the line like this. I really feel like I have such a problem with Jesus because he's so slippery. It's like trying to pin him down. Like, this is who Jesus is. I probably shouldn't endeavor to do that. But I think that there's something, I mean, I really liked the depiction. I think it's really important to say, like, the depiction of charity that Gregory has is not what we have today. And here are the problems, right, with what we have today. And then maybe here are the invitations with what he calls us to. And I think a lot of this, like, I kind of go back to imagination, because I think a lot of it is like, without what you shared about your church and the leadership there, it's like, I don't think people can imagine what we're talking about. And when you even talk about interdependence, it's like, these are like fully fleshed out relationships that are not about like calculus and, you did this for me and then I did this for you, whatever. I mean, these are, this is this dynamic give and take. So that was all really helpful for me to hear.
So maybe a follow-up question for you then, because I'm loving this conversation, is just, you talk about, the critical edge, but also the subversion in your commentary, which I love. And so I wonder, what are some of the things you're seeing able-bodied accomplices doing that is subverting some of that charitable mindset in churches that you're working with in your research? Where is that starting to show up in ways that are giving you hope? Maybe, hopefully.
Yeah, so the one example that comes to mind that is not maybe as like, I don't know, dramatic as maybe it sounds like I have in mind when I write these very dramatic things, but I feel like it makes such a difference, is this wonderful Catholic church that we did research with, St. John Chrysostom, which is right outside Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The folks there who were hosting, and they still host these masses of inclusion, which, I mean, have been these like, they're just like scratching their heads. What should the massive inclusion be like? Should it be entirely disability led? Should it be mostly, but they just go back and forth until the massive inclusion. I mean, it looks like there are other services because now there's so many disabled leaders and participants. So like, what are we even talking about? But one of the really lovely things when we had conversations with the disabled leaders and some of the family members of disabled folks in the congregation, and the director of parish ministry there, is that the director of parish ministry, when they would talk about real growth and beautiful fellowship, right, that's happening, she would kind of constantly point back and say, but we have struggled to do this well, and we have failed, and we have made mistakes, and we're still learning, and it's still hard, and we're not all the way there. I found those movements to be gracious, and important and decentering, right? Because she herself was not a person with a disability, but she was in this position of leading this ministry. And so I really, yeah, that's kind of what I think of. And so I guess it's like, this is good for me to hear myself say out loud, because it's more gracious maybe and more gentle than I might imagine it to be, and more subtle, because when I'm saying like repentance and confession, what I hear in that kind of speech that she uses is humility, and then I hear that kind of repentance and confession, but I hear it also in the sense of like decentering and continuing to uplift the wisdom and insights of disabled leaders, and wanting to continue to grow in fellowship, not just with people with disabilities, but with Christ. And that looks like Jesus to me. And that that's a really, I'm not a gentle person. And this is a really compelling example to me that I go, yeah, that must be Jesus doing that, because I couldn't have imagined that grace, in these conversations.
Heather, do you have any other questions or any comments that you'd like to offer Erin?
I had one other comment, if we have time. I just wasn't sure whether we did or not. I highlighted it just before we started, and it was just this idea that of the place that people have at the table. And I was wondering whether there were any other stories that you had, because your commentary was so short. I found myself wanting to have access to more of the stories that I guess will come out in your book, and I'm excited about that, for ways that people are making space at the table. At Vox, we talk a lot about making space for others at the table, and I love thinking about the vision in Luke 14 of the banquet being held, and everybody around the table at one stage in the story has a disability. They're lame and poor and blind, and so I wondered, because my imagination starts to think about all the accommodations that have to happen to really bring folks with disabilities to the table. I've had a child with a G-tube. I've had issues with navigating table legs around power wheelchairs. There's so much that's practical in this idea of drawing people to the table. Are there things you're finding that are helping to subvert the challenges of that?
Wow. So yes, but I think the challenge is still there. It's very real. I think that maybe I would just share a couple stories of my own experience. COVID has been so difficult for our family. Lucia is immunocompromised, and she wasn't vaccinated until really right on Christmas. So we were trying to be so careful. And in the United States, they kind of, the CDC rescinded the mask mandates. And so churches start taking their masks off and all that stuff. But I think that one of the things that is so kind of incredible about obstacles and tables is, and so this maybe does mean I'm more of a believer in miracles than I usually act like I am, is that Jesus, I feel like the Spirit blows where it wills, right? So it's like there will be these moments of access that are surprising and unanticipated. And so one of those for us in COVID was like, we started attending the Zoom prayer hour of this incredible church that ministers in Trenton and this really disenfranchised city there, and connecting with all these folks. Like, we didn't know them, we were just connecting with them online. We feel so, Lucia was so included, we felt so included, connected. Come to find out, like, we can't get her in their building because it's so inaccessible. And it wasn't just one of those, like, you could put a ramp here or there. It's like, once you got in the sanctuary, you had to go downstairs to go to the bathroom. So it was like, multiple access issues. And, this was, I was like, I don't know what to do with this, because we were given this gift for 6 months, right? Of like being part of this community. And that never would have happened. Like, we would have never, because we couldn't get into that building, we would have never been part of that. And so, like, what do I do with that? Because I don't want to, like, not be, I'm so gracious for that, but I'm also so angry, right, that those obstacles still exist. And, I think that this church, is a very poor church. Like, they don't have the money to do anything about this. And so we're just sort of like raging about it together and calling on God to do something. But this is the interesting thing about that, is like, I'm calling on God to do something and feeling so angry at the church, right? Just not this church, but just these obstacles. And then, Lucia's school sends a teacher out to our patio to teach her outside. And that teacher shows up on our patio and says, "Oh, Lucia, everyone at school loves you and misses you, and I'm going to love you because everyone loves you. I don't even know you. I'm going to love you." And I'm like, this is Jesus. I was just almost in tears. I'm almost in tears every day after the lesson she has with her teacher, because that incredible love. And then, she has a friend that she has developed a friendship with during the pandemic who, they're 7-year-olds. Lucia is non-speaking. This is another typical 7-year-old, but she FaceTimes her family, like, brings over dinner for us, all these things. So I guess, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I guess what I'm saying is, like, what I always kind of feel like is the tables are part of the problem, right? It's like the image of the table and the idea that the host is the church. It's like, freaking let go of the table. Like, let Jesus, be the host, do the ministry, take the table. And so then part of, I think, my desire and heart is just to amplify, like, where I've seen Jesus, even if it's in these secular places, to amplify where this church ministered to us. I think when I start, like, trying to dig in and solve all the problems by myself, I just start over functioning. And I think these are problems that we can all work on together. I think that they're problems that ideally, the church and individuals come alongside us and we, struggle together. But I do, like, this is the thing, I want to be I am so angry about these experiences of injustice and COVID, but I also can't deny how Jesus makes a way when there seems to be no way. And, I think that, I don't know, does that resonate with you at all?
Yeah, it really does. And I think the key thing for me that you said was, remembering that we as the church have to let go of the table, that it's not our table. We are not the ones who are the host. It is God's table. God is already hosting this banquet. All of us are already welcome at this table. And we need to look for the ways in which God is already creating the access for us, and mostly do a lot of work, just like not putting up new barriers for each other to make it harder for us to get to where God wants us to be. So yeah, thank you.
Wow, this conversation is continued to be so rich, and I can glimpse Jesus here with us too. So thank you for that. Our final question is around self-care. These issues are not distant from our life. they're right here in our messy, complicated, beautiful life. So we wanted to ask each of you how you care for yourself while you're doing this work that is so close to you. Maybe Heather can start us off the time.
Yeah, let's be honest, self-care is really hard. Like maybe that's just me, but I feel like any conversation around self-care, especially in Mad and Crip spaces, it's a really complicated topic. And I feel like so often it gets really multi-layered with like shoulds and ought tos and ableism and I don't know, just some world that I've never experienced where people can just take, an hour once a day for themselves to do something that is purely relaxing. I'm not quite sure where that exists. So I thought, like, to start the conversation, let's just put that to one side. And then it's winter, and then it's a pandemic, and then I'm a power wheelchair user in a place that gets a lot of snow. And then there are a lot of people all of the people who have been in my COVID bubble all have disabilities. So then it's one disability layered over another, and it's multifactorial in ways that break my I didn't do stats very far through school brain. So all of that is my reality. But in the middle of that, I'm fortunate that our city has a waterfront that is gorgeous. We've got about 5 kilometers of waterfront trails that are like asphalt paved, and the city keeps those snow-free almost every single day of the entire winter. So I can get into my accessible van and drive down to the waterfront and wheel around the waterfront. And even though it takes like half an hour on each side to get myself out the door and back in the door with enough warm clothes to do it, that's something that's really good for me. It's even better if I can meet up with a friend and do that stroll together. But I'm missing out on a lot of the things that I would normally do, like meeting up with friends in person and sharing time listening to live music with other humans in the same room. And I'm currently missing out on a lot of the foods I love because I had a horrible allergic reaction last week and we don't know what it was to. So now I'm eating just the very, very, very safest of blandest of boring foods, which is hard. So this is a long answer, but I think it's important. Like so much of self-care for me at this point is the basics. It's eating, it's sleeping, it's pacing my energy levels, it's using my wheelchair properly, it's not overscheduling myself, and it's trying to connect and have really meaningful conversations like this with other people on a regular basis. There's nothing fancy or flamboyant, and there's no Instagram posts happening based on my self-care routine, but it's got me through 22 months of pandemic so far, and hopefully it will last until the pandemic's over at least.
Awesome. Amanda, that sounds familiar to my self-care needs. Erin, how about you?
Well, I appreciate Heather naming how challenging self-care is. I always tell people when they ask about, what makes a difference in my life, it's Medicaid for my daughter. So it's nursing, private duty nursing supports for our family, which is why we live in New Jersey and we really can't move to many other places because we have everything set up here. And like I talked about, she also has wonderful teachers. But that, I think it's really important to name that because while I completely agree. I mean, taking walks outside is like my thing. In fact, I feel like it's just everything's going poorly if I just like go outside. Like things get a little bit better. And so that I'm really grateful to live in such a beautiful area of the country, and we have the same thing, paved paths, and Lucia loves to go on walks. But I also know that like I couldn't work if she didn't have nursing care. I couldn't sleep at night if she didn't have nursing care. All those things, that's just so critical. And then it's been so tricky because of the pandemic. So like, that's why I have her today. Her nurse has COVID. And, you know, we're in a bubble together, and her other nurse's son tested positive for COVID. So we've been without nurses for several weeks. And there's, you know, I love being with my daughter, but, you know, it's like you're trying to work and juggle all these things. And, you know, that whole like not really being able to be in one place at once, because, you know, at the same time that you're trying to work, you're answering insurance calls or whatever, and all of those things. So I think that really being able to not multitask to me is rest and self-care. I used to do a ton of centering prayer, but I've been doing the Ignatian Examen recently, and it's like so moving to me to like look back and see where God, you know, was with me in my day, and maybe I missed it and didn't even notice. And so I think that those kind of like restorative practices are really important for me, because I think so much of like what self-care holds out to us is like cheap and not restorative. And so trying to be intentional about that. And then at the same time, Heather, what you said like rings so true. It's like, well, this doesn't need to be another should or thing on my list. But I think that, you know, like that's why I think I'm so passionate about justice, because I want everyone to have the supports and accommodations that they need to live their lives fully. And, you know, I don't even know how someone can think about something like self-care, you know, when they're not safe, or they can't sleep, or they don't have proper medical support or access, or these things. And so, you know, it's a prayer for me, right? That like everybody would actually be able to have their basic needs met, let alone be restored.
Thank you so much, Erin and Heather. And I was just thinking, Erin, while you were talking, my therapist said to me a few weeks ago, because I was struggling with my own self-care, she said, now, Amy, what's your bare minimum level of self-care that you can have so you can sort of scrape through this time of your life? And I think my self-care level has been bare minimum lately. So that's okay too. I think for me, it helps me to let go of those shoulds as well. Like, oh, I should be doing X, Y, Z, and here's my little list of these little mini things I can do for myself. So we wanted to say, just in the interest of time, that we're going to be ending in a few minutes, and we just wanted to say thank you both so much for taking the time to come, and Lucia as well for taking the time to come to be with us today. And do you have any closing thoughts that you wanted to share? Miriam and I wanted to thank you both for taking the time to write and submit, and we really enjoyed working with you through the process, the editorial process in the journal.
I guess I would just say thank you. This journal is a triumph. It's such a gift to the world, and thank you all. I know that, I mean, speaking of self-care, it's like, I know this takes a lot of effort and energy to do this, but to be able to, I've been listening to podcasts, to be able to hear from all of these voices and perspectives, to be able to read all of these pieces. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Erin. It really is a labor of love from Miriam and I. And, you know, you were talking about overfunctioning before, and we try not to overfunction in this disability, like Mad Crip space. So yeah, we would appreciate your prayers too for us as we're continuing to discern the way forward and how we can best serve the Mad and Crip community.
Yeah, I would just add that to that. Thanks. My own, I recently attended a conference on autism and the church online, and went along to the publication conversation. And one of the questions that was asked, and I don't think was well answered, was how our journals and publications supporting the needs of those who are neurodivergent in that particular case, but those who are MAD and Crip and neurodivergent in terms of the process. And for me, it was just so incredible to be able to go through this process for the first time with others who I knew I could be my full disabled self with. If it didn't make sense, if I needed it broken down into smaller pieces, if I needed an accommodation, which I can get at university, I had that in the editorial process. And I was just so grateful to be able to begin that part of my academic life with those accommodations. And I think it's not only a gift to those who are going to submit in the future. And if you're listening to this and you're thinking about submitting and you are worried because of those things, like I really would encourage you to work with Miriam and Amy on this. But I also think it's an example that other publications need to start to consider. If they want to be talking about disability and disability theology, then they need to have people with lived experiences on the editorial board so that there is space for and assumptions of the need for accommodations in the editorial process. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you both, and see you next time on our podcast. I hope again soon.